Hi, my name is Chasta Musenda, and I want to thank you for listening to today's message. I hope this message challenges you to know Christ, experience community, and influence culture.
Dr. John Townsend describes grace as God being for us. And that's exactly what God did when he sent his son Jesus. He went to the cross, he was crucified and died to pay the penalty of my sin and your sin and all of humanity's sin, because God was and is for us. He was for us in that he made forgiveness possible. For us by coming to set us free from the penalty of our sin. For us by making it possible for you and I to be made right with God. Grace is God for us. Said another way, grace is the unmerited favor of God, meaning that grace is favor that you don't deserve and that you cannot earn. And because God is for us and his favor is unmerited, it cannot be earned, perhaps that's why the writer of Hebrews makes a statement about God's grace that is extraordinarily relevant for you and I today. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, he said these words, "Be sure that no one misses out on God's grace." I'm going to read that again because that, my friend, is the gospel, the hope that we have today. He said, be sure that no one misses out on God's grace. Why did the writer of Hebrews not want us to miss out on God's grace? Because here's what you have to understand about God's grace. God's grace saves us, and God's grace sustains us. God's grace saves us. It rescues us from our sin, from our brokenness, but at the same time, it doesn't end there. God's grace also sustains us to live for God. It sustains us by empowering us with the strength we need to serve him. And throughout Scripture, we see both. We see both God's grace to save us and God's grace to sustain us. In fact, there are over 120 references in the New Testament to the grace of God, 2/3 of which were written by the Apostle Paul. So last week, as we kicked off our series, we started by talking about that first aspect of grace, that grace saves us from our sin. The reality is, again, no matter how good we are, no matter how much we bring to the table, no matter how gifted we are, the truth is that none of us are good enough to save ourselves from our own sin that separates us from God. It is only made possible through what Jesus did at the cross when he paid the penalty of our sin. Saving grace, but it doesn't end there. There is also sustaining grace, and that's where I want to focus our attention this morning. I want to focus this morning on 3 ways God sustains us with his grace. Number 1 is this: grace sustains us in weariness. If I went around the room right now and I asked, how many of you are tired? I'm not even going to ask, okay? I mean, let's just, all right, it's almost a given in our culture today, right? There is just this epidemic of weariness, of being tired. I know in the last couple of months, I've experienced some weariness. There's just been some very challenging ministry times over the last couple of months. We've had some family health scares over the last couple months. I got COVID just a few weeks ago. Thank you. I thought it was over. Apparently it's not. And then my dad passed away at the end of June. It has been a weary time. But it's in times of weariness that I'm reminded of the words of Hebrews 13. This is what the writer says. Hebrews chapter 13. Let's put that on the screen. I want you to get these words deep inside your soul. Your strength comes from God's grace. It doesn't get much more direct than that. Your strength, the source of it, is God's grace. Which tells me when you're weary, there is strength available for you outside of yourself. And it stems from God's grace. John Newton, the man who wrote the famed hymn, Amazing Grace, understood this source of strength. Now, I've shared Newton's story in past messages, but what you may not know is what happened before he penned the words to Amazing Grace. You see, Newton penned Amazing Grace out of his personal pain. Out of his personal pain. And because here's what happened. On the day his wife Mary died, he had to preach a sermon on that Sunday. The next day he had to visit some church members. He had to officiate his own wife's funeral. And yet, as he was grieving deeply, he found God's strength through his grace. In fact, this is what John Newton later wrote. He said, "The Bank of England is too poor to compensate for such a loss as mine. But the Lord, the all-sufficient God, speaks and it is done. Let those who know him and trust him be of good courage. He can give them strength according to their day. He can increase their strength as their trials increase. And what he can do, he has promised that he will do." Jesus, the very Son of God who lived grace, is the manifestation of grace more than anybody else. He said it like this in Matthew 11. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." We could pause right there. I could say, anybody fit that category? Lots of hands would go up. You'd be like, "I'm weary and I got some burdens I could tell you about." But Jesus says, "I will give you rest." And then he says, "Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give is light." Sign me up. His burden is light. His grace in those moments makes the difference. Listen, you may have walked in here today, you may be weary, you may be worn out by life, but this morning I just want you to know there is a grace that can and will sustain you. It does not only save you, thank God for his saving grace, but that's the beginning, not the end. His grace continues past your day of salvation and sustains you all of life in your weariness. Number 2, grace sustains us in temptation. We all face temptation. And for each of us, that temptation comes in different shapes and different sizes, and one thing that you may not be tempted by, somebody else is, and what you're tempted by, someone else isn't. Right? It's just, we've all got our areas of temptation that we wrestle with, that we struggle with. You might be tempted by greed. You might be tempted by lust. You might be tempted by anger. You might be tempted by pride. We all have our areas of temptation. But I want you to know that even in temptation, God doesn't abandon us and wash his hands of us. His grace meets us even in our temptation. In fact, here's how the Apostle Paul said it in his letter to the Romans. Romans 6, verse 14, he said, "Sin is no longer your master, for you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live." Not pop in and out of, not have an occasional vacation to, not visit on every third weekend. No, you live, you dwell under the freedom of God's grace. Paul isn't saying that because we live under God's grace, therefore we're free to keep on sinning. That's not what he's saying. No, in fact, in the very next verse, look what he says, verse 15, he continues, back up. "Well then, since God's grace has set us free from the law, does that mean we can go on sinning?" Rhetorical question. He answers it. Of course not. Of course not. In fact, Paul's point is that because we live under the freedom of God's grace, it should actually drive us away from sin, not to sin. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer warned about the danger of this very thing when he talked about cheap grace. Cheap grace basically says that because God's grace is free, which it is, because God's grace is free, it doesn't really matter how we live. In other words, here's how we play it out. We say, well, it doesn't really matter if I sin because I can just ask God to forgive me, and he will. Bonhoeffer warned us of that view of grace. That's a cheap view of grace. That's treating grace with a familiarity that is just abusive. That approach to grace basically turns grace into a license to sin. And yet that was never what was intended by grace. Instead, Bonhoeffer noted that the solution to a cheap view of grace was to focus on how much our sin costs God. Our sin cost God his Son. Now, if something cost the life of a loved one in your life, I'm guessing you take a pretty serious view of that issue. My sin, your sin, all of humanity's sin cost God something dear. And it was his Son, Jesus, who gave his life at the cross. So if we take an attitude toward grace that says, hey, grace is free, so it doesn't really matter how I live, we're essentially saying to God, hey, God, it only cost you your Son. I'll just ask for forgiveness again. God in his extraordinary mercy and grace extends forgiveness, my friend, but hear me, it came with a great, 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 great price. Which should therefore cause us to say, God, I desperately need your saving grace. Your grace to save me from the sin that I cannot save myself from. The sin that separates me from you. But oh God, please, please, please in your mercy, don't stop there. God, please give me your grace because I want to honor you every day of my life. I want to live in your grace. I want to be saved by your grace, but then I want to live empowered by your grace. Hear me. God's grace was not only meant to save you from your sin, God's grace was also meant to keep you from sin. God's grace was meant to save you from your sin, and God's grace was meant to help you stop sinning. Does that mean we're perfect? Of course not. But when we take a holy view of God's grace, we recognize, Lord, I desperately need your grace to live and honor you. And the good news is that's exactly what grace does. In fact, the writer of Hebrews unpacks this in an extraordinarily practical way. In Hebrews chapter 4, this is what he says. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. Look at this next part. But we have one. In other words, we have a high priest. His name is Jesus. We have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let me just pause and say this. Jesus understands what it's like to be tempted. Because he was. He was tempted more than once, right? It wasn't just in the wilderness. No, Jesus faced temptation. The difference was he did not sin. We do, right? He did not. But the writer of Hebrews says, hey, I want you to know something. I want you to know that you have a high priest that he empathizes with you because he knows what that's like when you're in that moment of weakness and you're tempted. He knows. He can relate. He has been there. But then he doesn't stop. In the next verse, look what he says. Let us then, he gives us a solution, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence. Well, wait, time out. God, I am weak. I desperately need help. I have sinned. And yet you're telling me to approach your throne with confidence? Not arrogance. With confidence. Why? So that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, the verse right before this, remember, he just talks about, hey, you've got a high priest that empathizes with you because just like you, he's been tempted. So what should you do when that temptation shows up? Lean on the grace of God. Approach God's throne of grace because that's where you will find grace. That's where you will find mercy. That's where you're going to find what you need in your time of need. Grace sustains us when we're tempted. How do we receive the sustaining grace? It's just what it said. Approach the throne of grace. In other words, this is deep. You ready? Here we go. This is deep. Hold on. Get your pen out. You need to write this down. Here's how you receive here's how you receive grace in your time of need. You ready? Ask. There it is, okay? I know you're on the edge of the seat for that one, right? Ask. In fact, let me just ask a question. When was the last time you asked, hear me. When was the last time you asked, not for financial blessing, okay? That was probably this morning, okay? When was the last time you asked, not for the promotion? When was the last time you asked, not for something for your family that's in need? No. When was the last time you asked for His grace? That's a convicting question. Because we're good at asking for pretty much everything else. But when you ask for His grace, you find grace to sustain you when you're weary and when you're tempted. And number 3, you find grace to sustain you in hardship. In hardship. In his second letter to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul talks about what he terms his thorn in the flesh. Now, that phrase, thorn in the flesh, different theologians think it's a reference to different things. Some feel it's a reference to a physical ailment that Paul had, like he was sick or had some issue physically that was just a thorn in the flesh to him. Others believe, no, it wasn't a physical ailment. Instead, it was a person or a group of people that were opposed to the gospel, and no matter how hard Paul tried, it just seemed like the gospel wasn't going forward. Like, different people have different, I don't know what it is. Here's what I do know. What I do know is how Paul responded and how God responded to the thorn in the flesh. And we find it in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 and 9. This is what Paul said. He said, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Let me just pause. Have you ever had something you've pleaded with the Lord to take away from you? A problem, suffering, something. And some of you are like, 3? That's putting it mildly. Like add a couple numbers in front of the 3. Maybe you're getting close then. Paul's basically saying, look, and I don't know if he just picked a number or what, but obviously there were 3 times that he remembers deeply where he's pleading with God, Lord, would you please remove this thorn in the flesh? But he said to me, okay, this is Paul's response, but then we see God's response. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. If you were strong, you would take all the credit for yourself. And so would I. That's what we do. When we're good, we let people know we're good. Right? Didn't I do good? Aren't you proud of me? Right? But when you're weak, you don't have anything to offer. And suddenly the power of God is made perfect in that moment. It shines brightly because you recognize that wasn't me. That was all God. That was all God. His grace is sufficient. Look at that word sufficient. When you hear that word sufficient, what is it that comes to mind? Maybe some of you think about your bank account. Because have you noticed with your bank account, you never see the words sufficient funds. But I'm guessing if you've lived long enough, somewhere in your journey, you have seen the phrase insufficient funds, right? Some of you are like, yes, this morning when I woke up and I tried to buy coffee, it told me insufficient funds. It's a dreaded statement that means there's not enough to cover you in your time of need. Hear me, when it comes to God, you will never see insufficient grace. Never. Never. His grace is always sufficient. It's always sufficient. Think about it like this. If you took a sponge, I don't care how big the sponge is, if you took a giant sponge and you walked into the ocean and you submerged that sponge into the water and it began to soak up the ocean water, I don't care how big your sponge is, you will never soak up the entire ocean. It's simply too vast. It's simply too big. You can have a big sponge. The ocean is still bigger. In fact, when you've soaked up all the water, you walk out, you drag that thing out of the ocean, you haven't made a dent. You look at the ocean and go, it's still there. It seems as big as it was before I stepped in. Why? Because there's more than enough. There's more than enough. And guess what? I don't care how big the sponge of your problem is, the grace of God is so vast, you will never be able to soak it all up. Never. It's far too big. It's far greater than your hardship. Let's take it one step further. When you walk into the ocean, have you ever noticed you never see just one wave? Right? You don't, I mean, even if it's not a very windy day, I mean, the waves just keep coming. In fact, if you walk into the ocean, what happens? You can't even keep your balance. Why? Because every time you try to stand up, bam, you get knocked in the back of the head with another wave. And then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And you finally go, why am I doing this to myself, right? Why? I thought it was going to be a pleasant day at the beach. I'm being beaten by these waves. Hear me, that's how God's grace is. There is always another grace wave to hit you when you feel like you can't keep going. Because His grace is sufficient for you. There is a vast amount that will not only save you, but sustain you, my friend, in your hardship. Let me wrap up with this. Years ago, Heather Sample and her father, Kyle Sheets, were treating AIDS patients in Zimbabwe, Africa. Both of them were doctors, and they knew the risks that came with the work that they were doing and the surgeries that they were performing. In fact, Kyle was a 12-year veteran of doing medical missions trips and working with AIDS patients. But after one surgery, Heather noticed something on her dad's hand, and that was a cut. The cut that he got whenever he was performing a surgery on an AIDS patient. When she saw the cut, she immediately feared the worst, and she began to urge him to take treatment to help mitigate, to help prevent HIV infection. But Kyle was resistant. He didn't want to take the treatment because the treatment itself had extreme life-threatening side effects. But she kept pushing and she kept urging her dad. And finally he agreed, and after taking this treatment, within hours he became violently ill. He had nausea, he had fever, he was weak, and for the next 10 days he struggled immensely, and things just got worse and worse and worse and worse. And then he broke out in the rash of Stevenson-Johnson syndrome, which is almost always fatal. As a result, they moved their departure time up so they could return to the United States. And Heather wondered, is my dad going to make the 40-hour trip home? When it was time to board the plane, his temperature was 104.5 degrees. He was having trouble breathing. He was almost incoherent. His eyes were yellowed. His liver was enlarged and painful, and he was experiencing acute liver failure. Miraculously, Heather spoke to the pilots and convinced them that her father's only hope was to get back to the States and for them to get her there as quick as possible. When they boarded the plane, they sat on the plane, and Heather sat there and she began to process, what will I do if? And she asked herself, what am I going to do if I have to give my dad CPR? And she began to look where she was sitting, and she thought, can I get my dad out of his seat and lay him in the aisle of the plane and perform CPR on him? And she's doing the what if scenarios in her mind, trying to figure out, how am I going to respond to this moment? Several minutes into the flight, Kyle drifted asleep, and Heather decided to get up and go to the restroom. When she got up, she walked into the restroom, and when she walked into the restroom and closed the door behind her, she sank to the floor and she just began to weep and sob uncontrollably. As she began to fear for her dad's life, and she began to pray and ask God, God, I need your help. I need your help, God. God, this is bigger than me. I need your help. She was in the restroom so long, sitting on that floor, weeping and praying, that some passengers became concerned, and they went and they began to knock on the door. And when Heather opened the door, she saw 4 men standing there, and they asked, is everything okay? And she said yes, and then she began to explain what was happening with her father. And all 4 men looked at her and said, well, we're all doctors. In fact, not only are us 4 doctors, but there's 96 other doctors on this plane. And one of them is an infectious disease specialist. She had no idea she was on a plane with 100 doctors from Mexico who had been serving in medical missions as well in Zimbabwe. They began to talk, and they began to assess her father and realize that everything that needed to be done was being done. And then they told her, they said, listen, why don't we sit here with your father, and we're going to pray. We're going to begin to pray, and we're going to sit here with your father. Why don't you need some rest, you need some sleep. Why don't you do your best to sleep? And so they sat there with her father, and Heather fell asleep. Sometime later, she woke up, and her dad is standing in the aisle talking to the other doctors. And his condition is still ICU level. It's still serious. It's still critical. But his strength was beginning to return. And in the end, Kyle recovered with no trace of HIV. But as he reflected back on that moment, he said this. He said, there have been 3 times in my life when I have been on a plane, when a flight attendant asked, is there a doctor on the plane? Is there a doctor available? Where I was able to help. And he said, whenever I got on this plane, I wondered, will there be another doctor on the plane? And there were 100. And God, in his sustaining grace, gave Kyle what he needed in his time of need. Because that's the God that we serve. That's the God we serve, my friend. We can't calculate. We can't manipulate the grace of God. But in our time of need, if we will approach the throne of grace, we find a compassionate Heavenly Father waiting to receive our prayer and waiting to say, my grace and my mercy are enough for you in your time of need. Just ask. Just ask. So this morning, let me ask you, how do you need God's grace today? How do you need his grace today? For some of you, you're just tired. You're weary. You just need his grace to sustain you. For some of you, man, you're fighting a temptation and it just feels like, man, it's day after day after day after day. It's so unrelenting, but I want you to know there is a relentless grace that'll sustain you in that temptation. And some of you are facing the battle of your life right now. You're facing a hardship and you feel overwhelmed. His grace is sufficient for you. And some of you don't just need his sustaining grace. You need his saving grace. You need the gift of salvation through Jesus, where he forgives you and makes you right with God through his grace. Let's pray.
Thanks so much for listening to this message. If you'd like to learn more about Seven City Church, you can visit sevencitychurch.com. Or if you're in the Fort Worth area, we'd love to invite you to our Sunday service. God bless you and have a great day.